Are you going to say hello? Or are you just going to burp instead? You're just going to burp instead. Is it time for your nap? Is it? Are we going to pretend you've got a nap time? Are we? Hello everybody and welcome back to our channel. No? Is that out of your vocabulary? Is it? Okay. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. So I thought that I would today record my birth story and introduce you to my little man. Yes, I said little man. I had a little boy. I had my little boy on the 4th of October and he's now 5 weeks old exactly today. He was born at 5:50 in the morning after a very long labour, a very long induction process, and he was weighing 6 pounds 4. So without further ado, I would like you to meet my son, Giuseppe Thomas Izzo. We actually call him Joey. So his formal name is Giuseppe. He is named after Marco's dad, which is a family tradition that we were quite happy to stick to. However, he is known as Joey. So going forward, I will only really refer to him as Joey. He is a little dream. I absolutely love him. He is adorable. He's a little sleep thief. It has been the most wonderful, yeah, overwhelming, intense 5 weeks of my life. I do not know what has hit me. Oh, well, I do. He's here. But he's just a dream and I am so besotted, and I cannot believe that after so long and so many trials and tribulations and heartbreak and disappointment and everything else that comes with IVF has led us to him. I've felt an awful lot of kind of really complex emotions over the last few weeks, and it has certainly been a journey getting to here, kind of surviving, if I'm really honest. Joey wants to sleep, so I'm contemplating putting him in his basket while I do this video, but I know as soon as I do he's going to wake up and scream the house down, so I might risk it. In fact, I think I'm going to risk it, because otherwise I think I'm going to have a dead arm throughout this video. So hi Joey. Bye Joey. Okay, good. For anyone who is just wondering, I can literally see him from where I'm sat, just FYI. Anyway, hi. I am really sorry it has taken me, actually no, I'm not sorry, you know, I'm not sorry. Let's start for me to go on. I'm not sorry it has taken me this long to upload a video. I didn't intend on waiting 5 weeks to upload a video, but I also didn't anticipate the newborn stage being as hard as it is. I honestly thought that he would just sleep and I would just have hours every day to do what I want. That's not kind of how, how it goes at all. He sleeps a lot, just on me, so it's a bit tricky. Anyway, hello. I was going to do 2 separate videos of kind of meet Joey and then do my birth story, but I decided that I would combine them both into one. I've introduced him on Instagram. I introduced him on Instagram immediately. I didn't actually want to, so quite a lot of people I think had figured that I was having Joey because I just suddenly went offline for a good few days, about 6 days. And I hadn't intended on actually announcing until he was a few days old, kind of getting into our little bubble and kind of getting used to things and then uploading and announcing. But my dad got a little bit excited and my dad announced it on Facebook before we had even finished telling Marco's family. So my dad was, I can't remember if he was the first or second person I rang, but anyway, I rang my dad and my dad got very excited, put something on Facebook, tagged Marco and I in it. Now on my Facebook, I have to accept anything I'm tagged in, so none of like my friends had seen it, but Marco's hadn't, and so everybody saw it. And my mum had started getting messages and things like this, like, so I was like, okay, we kind of need to announce it now because it's already been announced. Bless him, I wasn't cross at him, he got very excited, and it was nice that he was so excited, but I kind of just announced it a lot quicker on that basis. And I started having a lot of messages saying things like, oh, I assume you're in labour, I assume you've had the baby, blah blah blah. So yeah, so Joey's birth was announced a lot quicker than I anticipated, but I also put up a question box on Instagram the other day about what kind of questions you would like me to answer in terms of my birth, my induction, and so that's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do it as a formal Q&A, but I know kind of what questions were asked and I will try and cover as much as possible as we go. So for those of you that are new here, or for those of you that don't know, I had an IVF pregnancy. It was our 3rd cycle of IVF, and at my 36-week scan, so leading up to my 36-week scan, Joey was breech the whole time. So there were talks about having an ECV, or there were talks about a potential C-section if he hadn't turned by
the 36-week scan. When we went for the 36-week scan, he had turned, which was great, so that was fine, but he was measuring quite small, and therefore it was recommended that I had an induction. I had always said that I wouldn't have an induction based on IVF alone, and it's absolutely a personal choice. You do what's right for you. However, I made the decision that if the only reason they wanted me to be induced was because of IVF, I would say no, unless there was a medical reason for it. And in this case, there was a medical reason for it. Like I say, Joey was seemingly quite small, and after a lot of conversation with my consultants and a lot of conversation with my husband, we decided that it was the best thing for us to do. So we agreed to an induction at 39 weeks. I didn't really want to be induced any earlier than that. They were quite happy to leave it to 39 weeks. They just didn't want me to go over the 40-week mark, which was fine. So on Thursday, the 29th of September, I was booked in for an induction. I had heard a lot of horror stories about inductions, but also about our maternity ward at the hospital I was at, and how busy it had been, and how people were getting turned away, and how people who were booked in for an induction weren't going in for inductions, and people that had gone in for inductions were there for days on end without anything even happening, etc. And so I was a little bit nervous. There was another hospital that I could request to go to on the day if they were kind of oversubscribed, if they weren't going to be able to get me in that day or for a couple of days. Obviously, the thing with maternity wards is you can never kind of predict how many people you're going to have in. You cannot predict how many people are going to go into labour on one day. So obviously people who had gone into labour spontaneously were going to take priority over us, which was absolutely fine. So Thursday the 28th was the provisional date that I was booked in for my induction. I had to ring the hospital at, I can't remember if it was 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, but I had to ring first thing and ask whether or not they were able to get me in, which I did. And they weren't able to get me in that morning, but they were fairly confident that they were going to be able to get me in that afternoon, because they were moving a lot of people over to the recovery ward. So that was it. So I had to ring them back at like 2 o'clock. So that day we decided, do you know what, we're going to have a great day. We're not going to sit around just waiting. We went for, I can't remember what we did. We dropped Bruce off at my mum's the night before. So that morning we kind of just lounged around the house, just did some bits, just made sure everything was good and ready and that we'd got everything we needed in the bag. We went out for a nice lunch, we went out for a big pizza. We actually went to Franco Manca, and the reason we went to Franco Manca was because when I had my transfer for this cycle, and the embryo, which turned out to be Joey, was put inside me, the first meal we had post-transfer was Franco Manca. So we were like, okay, let's make our last supper Franco Manca too. So that's what we did. Yeah, then we called them back at 2 o'clock and they told me to go in at 4:30. And they were ready for me, so that's exactly what we did. I felt so calm, so relaxed. I still don't think it had quite sunk in that I was going to be giving birth. It was quite surreal, if I'm really, really honest, but I was really excited. So we got to the hospital and we were checked in really quickly, checked in like it was a hotel. I think they had to close the ward the day before because of how busy it had been. So a lot of the delivery rooms were empty. I think, I don't know that for sure, but a lot of the delivery rooms were empty. So rather than being in the induction ward where Marco would have had to go home at night had nothing happened, we were put straight into a delivery room. We were put in the biggest room on the ward, and it was actually the room that was dedicated for delivering twins. So there was also a spare bed in there, which meant that Marco could stay, and it also meant that he didn't have to sleep in a chair, he had a bed, which turned out to be an absolute blessing because of how long we were in there. So I was really happy that he didn't have to go home. He was happy that he could stay with me. We were in the delivery suite, we were in the room that we were going to have our baby, and it was great. Everything kind of happened really quickly. I then had the pessary, which, if you don't know, so I will kind of talk through the induction process as it happened for me, because I'm pretty sure I had everything that you could have had. Again, obviously, you know, I'd said about my birth plan and my birth preferences. My preference, if you like, was to have a really calm birth off the monitors in the pool. That was all kind of shot to hell, which, you know, was fine. It needed to happen. But we were in this room and the pessary was put in, and with the pessary you kind of have 24 hours to go into labour, and if that doesn't work you move on to the next stage, which is a gel. So they put the pessary in, and at this point I was hoping that maybe I had gone into hospital being slightly dilated, but nothing. I was 0 centimetres when I walked into that hospital. My cervix was really high, and yeah, just clearly not ready. So we had the pessary, and I had throughout the night like mild kind of crampings, like really mild period pains almost, but other than that, absolutely nothing. So when they came back the next day, so we then went on to kind of Friday afternoon, they then, what happened then? Yeah, so they then checked my cervix, and I was literally about 1 centimetre, so it hadn't really done all that much. And then they went for the gel, which again, it's like a pessary, but it is a gel that they put in to your vagina, and obviously hope that therefore that triggers the labour. So you can have 2 of those 6 hours apart, so you effectively have 12 hours with that. So when they came back, obviously, like I say, I wasn't dilated really anymore, so we went on to the gel. I had the gel, and then I was starting to get the tightening, so I thought that, you know, I was getting contractions, we thought things were moving, but unfortunately after both rounds of the gel, I still was only 1.5 centimetres. Obviously my waters hadn't broken, I wasn't in labour, etc, etc. So at this point we were kind of, yeah, a bit deflated, because it was already Saturday and I wasn't any closer really to having the baby. I'd been on the monitor throughout, so they monitor you. I was wired up on the monitor, and they were kind of checking his heart rate constantly. Joey's heart rate was kind of, it kept going quite high, which was a bit of a problem. So it meant that kind of throughout the night, like I basically didn't sleep at all while I was in hospital, because where I was only supposed to be monitored for like half an hour every 4 hours, I ended up being on the monitor for hours at a time, because his heart rate kept increasing, which was obviously quite worrying, but it also meant that, you know, I was kind of stuck on this bed and couldn't really go anywhere. But it was fine, and if I'm really honest, the time wasn't going particularly slow, time was going quite fast. We were okay. I was happy that Marco was there. I had packed so many different snacks, it was ridiculous. We had quite a lot of admin work that needed doing for the salon, so I'd taken my laptop in and I was pretty much working while I was in hospital. And it was all quite, I don't know, I was quite deflated by the end of the gel, because I was a bit like, okay, I don't really know where we go from here. I was told that they could try and break my waters, but they weren't going to do it that day, because they basically didn't have the staff in order to give me the one-to-one care that I needed if I was to then, obviously if they were to break my waters and I was to go into labour. So the next kind of 12 hours or so, or was it 24 hours, I can't even remember now, but it was just a waiting game to see if I would go into labour naturally. Obviously I didn't. So at that point we were talking to the consultant. The consultant had said to me that I can go for an elective C-section if I wanted, but I didn't want that. I felt like there wasn't a need for it, and I understood that they were short-staffed and that they kind of, you know, obviously there was a reason I was being induced early, but for me there was no reason to have a C-section at that point. And I had spoken to the midwives that were coming in. I literally met, I think, every single midwife that works in that department over the course of the 5 days that I was there. And there just wasn't any need for it, so I didn't feel that it was necessary. We were then told, okay, they can't do another gel for 24 hours after the last one. So it ended up being really a bit of a waiting game until either somebody could break my waters or they could do the other gel. It did end up being a case of them doing another gel and seeing whether or not that helped to dilate me, and so that was that. Obviously it didn't. I was still, after the third gel, I was still 1.5 centimetres, pushing 2, but 1.5 really. So it was a bit tricky, because we were then in a situation where it was, okay, so they can either break my waters, try and break my waters when they had somebody available, or we could have an elective C-section, or I could go home, and once all the drugs were out of my system, I could then come back. I wasn't too happy to do that. So by this point it was a Sunday, so we'd been in hospital for 3 days, and I felt a little bit like, okay, if I'm able to go home, allow the drugs to get out my system, and then come back into hospital. I was due on the Thursday. I was a bit like, to me, therefore I can't have been that high risk, and there was no point going in for that induction if you're then gonna let me kind of go to my due date anyway. it just kind of defeated the point for me. And I had that conversation with the midwife and she completely agreed, and therefore, you know, I did agree that I would just stay there and we would just wait until there was somebody available to break my waters. Anyway, the whole of Sunday, there was nobody available to break my waters. They were so busy. There was a couple of people who had come in for inductions that day, who I think one of them had actually then gone into labour naturally. I think one of them had progressed one hell of a lot quicker than me. I honestly felt like Rachel Green in that episode of Friends where she is screaming because everybody that's coming in is more dilated than her, which is exactly how I felt by this point. So it was just a waiting game of waiting for somebody to break my waters, and I was doing loads on the birthing ball. I was walking around the hospital. We were going to the coffee shop. I was literally doing laps of the car park, trying to encourage my body to go into labour naturally, but it just wasn't happening. And I think by the Sunday night, I had got quite upset and I was really quite deflated because I just felt like I was starting to question whether I was doing the right thing being induced. I was starting to question whether or not he was ready to come out, and I just felt like I thought we would be home by the Sunday. We obviously went into hospital on the Thursday. I'd anticipated being home by the Sunday. I was bored. I was in this room. I was sick of looking at the same four walls, in all honesty, and I just wanted to go. I really, really just wanted to go. So on the Monday, again, it was a case of waking up in the morning and being told, we will try and break your waters today, but we can't guarantee. It does depend on staffing. It depends how many people we have come through the door, etc, etc. I had another cervical exam. I still hadn't progressed any further than 2 centimetres. The cervical exams, by the way, I hated. So many people had said to me it was just like a smear test. I needed gas and air for the cervical examinations because I just thought they were horrible. But I was such an idiot. So I'd never had gas and air before, and it was only on the final day when they checked my cervix that Monday morning that they told me to start sucking on it kind of before they went in, and I was like, what? I had literally not even started puffing on the gas and air until they'd gone in, so it literally wasn't working for me until that last day when I started using it before they did the cervical examination. So it felt like a bit of a plonker there, but it was all done, it was fine. So that was that. Gas and air, I think, is the best thing in the world. I felt like I downed a bottle of Prosecco every time I'd used it. It was wonderful. But yeah, I still hadn't on the Monday morning progressed any more than 2 centimetres, and it was once again a waiting game. So we were sat in the room, literally doing nothing, doing work for the salon again. I think I ordered a load of business cards and flyers and loyalty cards and this, that and the other while I was in the hospital. And then the midwife came in and said that there was somebody available and they were going to break my waters. So at 1 o'clock on the Monday afternoon, my waters were broken. I had a student midwife in the room with us, which I was more than happy to have. It was something that on my birth preferences, I said I was really happy to have a student in there. She tried to break my waters, she couldn't, and so then the midwife did it. Obviously, like I say, I was no more than 2 centimetres, but they broke my waters, which was just the weirdest experience ever. It is not like you imagine. It is not like it is on the movies where it's just a kind of big gush and that's it. I was just constantly trickling for about, well, for ages and ages and ages. So I then had kind of 2 hours to see whether or not my contractions would start naturally after they'd broken my waters. So Marco and I used that time to basically just walk around and try and trigger it ourselves. So again, we were doing laps of the car park. We went to the Costa in the hospital. We had a coffee, and yeah, we were just doing everything we could. I went back to the room. I was dancing around. I think there's a video on my phone somewhere of me just dancing in this hospital room that I'd sent to my sister, and obviously it's me. Nothing happened. So I literally, from 4:30 on the Thursday right through to 3 o'clock on the Monday, like I said, they broke my waters at 1 o'clock on the Monday, so until 3 o'clock on the Monday afternoon, I just wasn't responding to this induction. Like, the induction just didn't work for me, basically, which was really, really frustrating. But then when they came in at 3 o'clock, they checked my cervix again. I still wasn't dilating anymore, but my waters had been broken, so I was put on the drip. Now, I can't remember what the drip is called, but it basically ramps up the contractions and forces you, well, my understanding is anyway, it forces the contractions, forces the dilation, and is kind of the final part of the induction process. So I was put on this drip, which obviously meant that my option for a water birth was taken away. I had to be on the monitor constantly, so I wasn't able to kind of move around as much as I'd wanted to. I was kind of stuck next to the bed, but I had got the birthing board and everything else, and Marco was there. We'd got our playlist on. I say we'd got our playlist on. My biggest piece of advice is to make a playlist. I had started doing so, and then I'd forgotten about it and didn't do it. And the most frustrating thing for me was trying to find music and trying to find a playlist that I would listen to where I wasn't skipping every other song. So make a playlist. But I was sat on the ball and everything was going, you know, really quickly from that point. The pain started really quickly. I was on the gas and air, which, like I say, I think is the most wonderful thing in the entire world. But I was on the gas and air, and still I was barely progressing. Every time my cervix was checked, I had literally barely moved. I wasn't really getting any closer until I think about 11 o'clock when they checked again, and I was around, I think, 3 or 4 centimeters. So I really wasn't progressing very quickly. At 11 o'clock at night, so I had done 7 hours of just gas and air at this point. In my birth preferences, I had said that gas and air was really what I wanted. I kind of said I was open to everything, but I wanted gas and air. Gas and air just wasn't cutting it anymore. I had asked for an epidural. I wasn't able to have an epidural when I wanted it because the anaesthetist had just gone in for a C-section. So I had an option of waiting around, well, they said it was kind of going to be a minimum of an hour, or I could have the, I think it's called pethidine injection. But if I had that injection, I had to wait a little bit longer if I then decided I wanted the epidural. I was in so much pain. I was really struggling at this point with the contractions on just gas and air. So I did have the injection.
You've decided you want to join us, haven't you? Yes, yes. You don't want to nap anymore, do you? No, we've had milk, we've got a nice full belly, but we don't want to nap again. So you're coming to join, aren't you? And we're going to tell everybody about how you came into the world, okay? Now you're going to sleep. Where was I? So the pethidine injection, I did accept, I did have. I felt as though it took the edge off. I can't remember where in my body they injected it, but it did take the edge off. It didn't make it completely pain-free. I didn't expect it to at all, but it did kind of just mellow things a little bit. I did notice a bit of a difference. I still hadn't dilated much further, and so as soon as I was able to have the epidural, I did. I don't really understand why there's quite a lot of stigma around having the epidural. I personally found that it didn't completely get rid of the pain. Like, it doesn't make it completely painless I mean, it does, it gets rid of the pain, but you still feel the pressure. So I could still feel when I was contracting, when it came to the pushing, I could feel that. You can feel what's going on, just like I say, the pain itself has kind of gone. So when the time came, I was able to have the epidural on the basis that I haven't really progressed anymore. I did ask for the epidural. I found the epidural quite scary. Like, Marco said that he had never seen me looking so scared in all my life, because I was well aware by this point my contractions were really often. I wasn't getting much of a break in between them, that I was so worried that I would have a contraction during the epidural and that it would go wrong and I would either be paralyzed or that I would have some kind of nerve damage, etc. Are you going to sleep now? Is that it? Is my voice soothing? Okay. So that's what I did. So I decided to have the epidural. I was really scared. I had it. It was fine. I did have quite a big bruise on my back after the event. So over the next few days, like, I did really feel like I'd been hit by a bus, and my back was very sore, and I did have a big bruise on my back, which I'm not sure is normal or not, but it did the job. And after the epidural, I relaxed so much. I felt really glad that I did it, and still to this day I look back and I am so glad that I had the epidural. And in all honesty, if we were lucky enough to go through this again, I would not hesitate in asking for an epidural. I really wouldn't. I don't understand what the big deal is around them. I understand obviously the risks with them, but I don't really see why people are so against them. But each to their own. But it was the right decision for me at the time. So that's what we did. The hormone drip that I was on, I had
I was told that I would only be on it for 8 hours, but I wasn't able to have it up to the maximum dose that they're able to give you because Joey's heart rate kept dropping and rising and dropping and rising. So on the basis that it was obviously stressing him out, I wasn't able to have it for much longer. I wasn't able to have it much higher than I had it. So things were, I suppose, slower on account of that. I imagine if I had have had it ramped up, I maybe wouldn't have been in labour for as long as I was. I'm pretty sure I had the epidural at around 1 AM. I might be wrong there, but it was late. I still wasn't really progressing any further. There was a point where, because they obviously couldn't increase the hormone drip, my contractions were kind of fizzling out. Like, I felt like they were getting further apart rather than closer together. There were more conversations about the potential of surgery, of having a C-section if things didn't progress by a certain point. I'd had the emergency buzzer go off because his heart rate had gone again. It had got, I can't remember if it was because it had got too high or too low. I feel like it kept fluctuating between the two. I think at this point it had really dropped off. And so the hormone drip had to be turned down again. And things were just getting really frustrating. I either wasn't responding to things or Joey was getting distressed. And it was just quite a stressful time, I think. I wasn't, I don't know, like, I don't look at my birth and think it was a negative birth at all. Like, I do really see it as a positive experience. But it was quite stressful in those last few hours when things didn't feel like they were gonna progress any further. I was getting ready to go into surgery. I was kind of coming to terms with that, and Marco and I were having the conversation of, okay, it does look as though this is where it's going to go because I'm not dilating. There's only so much time they can give me on this drip. And obviously once that option's been exhausted, a C-section really was my only option. However, at about 4 AM, I think I'd progressed to about 7 centimetres, and so we were happy to keep pushing through. And then at about 5 o'clock, I reached 10 centimetres. I was lucky that I reached it when I did, because at that point the conversation of surgery was becoming a very, very real conversation. I didn't have much longer left. I think really I had about an hour to give birth to Joey, and if I hadn't, then I probably would have gone into surgery at that point. And he wasn't quite, I mean, he was in position, but I'm pretty sure, I can't remember, like, I feel like because I'd obviously had the gas and air, then the pethidine, then the epidural, things kind of got a bit hazy in terms of my memory around this point, but I'm pretty sure I did have like an hour to give birth to him, and if I didn't, I was going into surgery. And when I reached 10 centimetres and he was kind of ready to come out, he was, I'm pretty sure, like on a bone, because he came out really swollen, and I remember them saying something about a bone, but he wasn't quite where he should have been. And whilst I wasn't feeling like I was ready to push as such, I needed to start pushing. And so I did. And so at that point, I just started pushing to get him out. And I felt like Superwoman at that point, if I'm really honest. I think pushing him out was definitely my favourite part of the birth. It was incredible. It was, obviously I did have an epidural, so I can't say in terms of, like, my friend who had a baby a couple of weeks after, when she was in labour, was texting me saying, you know, is the pushing worse than the contractions? And I was like, I honestly don't know, because I had the epidural. Like, so for me, no. But for somebody who's not had an epidural, I don't know. But that kind of ring of fire that people talk about, I didn't really experience as such. But I was pushing, and that part was, I can't remember exactly how long I was pushing for, but that part was quite quick. And I know that when he started crowning, they were like, oh my God, he's got quite a lot of hair. And they let me kind of reach forward and feel that, which was just the most amazing thing. Like, I will never, ever, ever forget having my baby and feeling them come out of me, like with my hand, like feeling his head while he was still inside me. It was the most surreal experience ever. And at that point, Marco kind of decided he was going to watch, which I didn't think he would. Neither of us thought he would. But he just thought it was amazing. He was so kind of in awe of the female body, if you like, watching his son be born into the world. It was incredible. I was on my back with stirrups, which again wasn't part of my birth plan. I didn't want to be on my back. I had asked whether or not there was any other position I could be in, but on the basis I was on the monitor and the position that he was in, really I needed to be. It was fine. I had the epidural, etc. I felt like at that point I was desperate to get him out, and I didn't really care how he came out. but I don't think I wasn't uncomfortable, and it didn't feel unnatural to be giving birth on my back. I think it is, like, again, if I was to have my time again, I would still like to have the water birth on all fours, rather than being on my back hooked up to a monitor and all the rest of it. But it didn't bother me being on my back. It was absolutely fine. And then obviously he was born at 5:50, and the midwives quite literally went, "It's and Marco then went, "Boy!" And he was passed over to me. We had immediate skin to skin while he was still covered in the vernix, etc. We had that golden hour. We managed to establish breastfeeding very quickly. He latched on very quickly. Unfortunately, things haven't quite gone to plan with the breastfeeding, but I will do a whole different video on that because I just don't have the time or the will or the energy to do that now. And things are still very much ongoing. But he did latch immediately, and it was just incredible. It really was so incredible. He was quite swollen when he came out because, like I say, he'd been on a bone or whatever. And when I look back at photos, I can't believe how big and swollen his face was. Like, his face seems to have got smaller while the rest of him now seems to have got bigger. And it was just amazing. And I really, I don't know, like I was in such a bubble in that moment. It really was incredible. And I don't look back at, like I said, I don't look back at my birth and think it was a negative experience at all. It was certainly long going into hospital on the Thursday and not giving birth until the Tuesday morning. It was long. I don't necessarily think the induction was necessary. I'll get onto that in a moment. And obviously at times it was scary. I had the emergency alarm go off again while I was pushing because his heart rate had dropped. So I know at one point I was pushing, I had my eyes closed and there were 2 people in the room, and then I opened my eyes and there were 7 different doctors and nurses in the room, and things got very scary very quickly for me. But again, it was his heart rate, it settled and everything was fine. But so it was stressful. There were certainly times where I really thought I was going into theatre. I had prepared myself for that, and so I would say that it was slightly turbulent. I did tear. It wasn't a massive tear, it was more of a graze than anything, but I did have to have stitches. The recovery for that, it took a couple of weeks. I was very sore for a couple of weeks, and like I say, because my back had bruised as well, I did feel like I'd been hit by a bus. But then he was here, and you know, we were home 5 hours later. I feel like there's a lot that I've had to process in terms of the birth, not in terms of the birth itself, but like I say, I kind of felt by the end of it that he absolutely wasn't ready to come out. I think given how long the induction took, given the fact that I didn't really respond to the first part of the induction, and then, you know, how long I mean, from my waters breaking to him being born, it was just short of 17 hours, which felt like a really, really long time. I don't know if that is a long labour. I don't know what short labour is, what a long labour is, what an average labour is, but that for me felt like it was a really, really long labour. Hey, you're just staring. You're just staring. It felt like a really long labour. I feel like it's difficult because with the information that I had at the time when I made the decision to have the induction, if I was to do that again and I only had the information that we had at the time and there was no more information available, like it's not like the consultants you know, knew that it wasn't really necessary but were encouraging it anyway or anything like that. Like, we all had the same information at the time of making that decision. I would absolutely make the decision to have that induction again based on the information that I had at the time. However, based on the information I now have, knowing how the birth went, etc., knowing that he came out at £6.4, so he was small, but he wasn't necessarily tiny, based on the way that the birth went, based on the way that the induction went, based on his birth weight and everything I know now, if I had all of that information and I knew that, I wouldn't have had the induction. So in hindsight, I'd have said no, but I still stand by my decision that I made at the time. I found that quite difficult to deal with. I found it quite difficult kind of accepting the fact that I'd had the induction after he arrived, if that makes sense. And I felt like I had been robbed of the last part of my pregnancy, and obviously I hadn't. Like, I made that decision, and I made that decision that I absolutely stand by and know that at the time it was the right decision to make for me and my family. But I feel like if we had have been left to have a spontaneous labour, I think he would have been quite overdue. I don't think he would have, I mean, he wouldn't have arrived on his due date. Like I say, I was 0 centimetres when I went in. I very much, very much doubt that he would have come on the 6th of October. But I do think he would have been late. So I had been told that the 18th of October was kind of the latest they would let me go. I say let, as obviously everything is my decision. So 12 days over, and I really do think that he'd have been around 10 days late. I really don't think he was ready to come out. And so I don't regret my decision, but I wish I'd made a different decision. And I wish that I had been allowed those last few weeks of my pregnancy. But like I say, I don't look back at my birth and think it was negative. I felt like Superwoman after I had given birth to him, and I still cannot believe that I managed to have a vaginal birth. You are trumping in my hands. That is a big one. God, it stinks too. Sorry about that. Yeah, I still can't believe I managed to have a vaginal birth, and when I look back at that, I think it was the most incredible thing. Like, I loved giving birth, I really did, and I really hope that I get to do it again, because it was just the most amazing experience. And like I say, while I found the entire birth to be a bit stressful, a bit touch and go, a bit turbulent, I really don't think it was a negative birth experience. Like, I look back at it and just think of it so fondly, and I loved my midwife, like really loved her. She was incredible, and we had a student paramedic in for the birth, and she was just great. And I just loved it. Like, I look back at it so fondly, and at the end of the day, it gave me my son, and I can't not be grateful for that. So yeah, I wish, if I had my time again, I probably wouldn't have the induction, but that's not to say it wasn't the right decision at the time. Yeah, that's where I'm at with it, really. I do think we ended up going home quite quickly. We were home. I didn't even go on to the transitional care. Like, I didn't go into recovery at all. I left the room that I gave birth in. I pretty much, once he was weighed, etc., and he was asleep in the cot, I had a shower, I got the aftercare stuff, and we went, pretty much. We were home by around midday. At the time, I was over the moon. Like, one of the first things I said when he was born was, when can I go home? Because I had been in the hospital for so long. Marco is self-employed. He had booked off the 2 weeks starting from the day that I'd gone into hospital. He couldn't then extend that, although in theory, yes, he could, because he's his own boss. He couldn't, on the basis that he'd already moved 2 weeks worth of clients. It would have just been it would have been really problematic and probably a bit detrimental to the business if he'd done any more than that. So it had already eaten into nearly a week of his paternity leave, which really upset me. And so I wanted to go home. I just wanted to go. So I had asked for it to be as quick as possible. I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd had a bit longer in hospital. Although he latched well in hospital, I feel like I could have done with a little bit more help just to make sure that feeding had been established. So I do wish we hadn't gone home as quickly. But, you know, at the end of the day, it is what it is. I can't change it now. There's no point me dwelling on that. But yeah, that's how I felt anyway. And like I say, for the first kind of 2 weeks, I think, of Joey's life, I really regretted my decision to have an induction, and I felt really cross about it, and I felt really angry that I'd lost those last few weeks of my pregnancy, because I loved being pregnant. I absolutely adored it. And again, I'll be really sad if I never get to experience that again. And whilst I have Joey, and I'm very grateful for Joey, and I'm absolutely not thinking about having another one anytime soon, that part of infertility hasn't left me, and there is still part of me that is just cross that, you know, the choice isn't a choice as such. It's a lot more complex than that. So we will see, but like I say, we're really not thinking about that now. So yeah, so he's here. We named him in hospital. His name was spelt wrong on all his documents already, so we're already having issues with that, which is a pain in the backside. In terms of his name, so like I say, we named him Giuseppe Tomasizzo. Giuseppe, like I said at the beginning, is Marco's dad's name, and we followed a tradition there. It's Italian for Joseph. I agreed to having Giuseppe on the basis that he had, you know, a more modern nickname, if you like, hence the Joey. And I love it. I love Joey Izzo. I think he sounds like a little New York gangster. It's great. We're setting him up for a life of crime. But that's it. So that is my birth story. I hope I've answered everything. If I haven't, do let me know in the comments and I'll try and answer as many of your questions if you have them. But thank you so much for watching. I will do a video on my breastfeeding journey going forward, and yeah, there'll be lots of baby content. So thanks for sticking around and watching this next chapter of our lives. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you soon.